Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. World War II Commanders. How American leadership shaped victory. World War II was not won by numbers alone. Behind every major operation stood commanders whose decisions determined success or disaster. For the United States, the war became a test not only of soldiers and industry, but of leadership under unprecedented pressure. American commanders entered the conflict with limited experience in modern global warfare. Over the course of the war, they were forced to learn rapidly, adapt to failure, and coordinate forces on a scale never attempted before. At the start of the war, American military leadership faced significant challenges. The U.S. Army had not fought a large-scale conflict since World War I, and many senior officers had spent decades in peacetime roles. Doctrine was outdated, coordination between services was incomplete, and command structures were still evolving. Early operations exposed weaknesses in planning and execution, particularly when American forces faced experienced German and Japanese commanders. World War II forced a new kind of leadership. Commanders had to manage massive armies across multiple continents while coordinating land, sea, and air forces simultaneously. Decisions made thousands of miles from the front could determine the fate of entire campaigns. Communication delays, incomplete intelligence, and rapidly changing battlefield conditions meant that commanders often had to act with uncertainty, knowing that mistakes would cost lives. One of the defining figures of American leadership was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Unlike battlefield commanders who led troops directly in combat, Eisenhower's role was strategic and diplomatic. As Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, he was responsible for coordinating forces from multiple nations, balancing political pressures, and maintaining unity among allies with different priorities. His leadership style emphasized cooperation, compromise, and long-term strategy rather than personal glory. At the operational level, commanders such as Omar Bradley and George S. Patton represented different approaches to warfare. Bradley emphasized careful planning, coordination, and minimizing unnecessary losses. He believed that discipline and steady pressure would wear down the enemy. Patton, by contrast, was aggressive, outspoken, and driven by speed and momentum. His rapid armored advances exploited enemy weaknesses, but sometimes carried higher risk. Both approaches played critical roles at different stages of the war. In the Pacific, American leadership faced a completely different set of challenges. Commanders such as Chester Nimitz and Douglas MacArthur operated across vast ocean distances, managing naval, air, and ground forces in an environment where logistics were as important as combat. Strategic decisions about which islands to attack and which to bypass shaped the course of the war. These choices saved lives by avoiding unnecessary battles while maintaining relentless pressure on Japan. Leadership in World War II was not static. Commanders were evaluated continuously. Those who failed were replaced, sometimes abruptly. This willingness to remove ineffective leaders became one of America's strengths. The military learned that rank alone did not guarantee competence. Adaptability, judgment, and the ability to learn from mistakes mattered more than reputation. World War II transformed American military leadership. Commanders emerged from the war with experience in joint operations, coalition warfare, and large-scale logistics. Their decisions shaped not only victory in the conflict, but the structure of modern military command. The war proved that leadership was not about perfection, but about learning, adapting, and making decisions under pressure. This is the story of how American commanders learned to fight and lead in the most demanding conflict in history. Their choices influenced millions of lives and determined the outcome of World War II. Early command mistakes and the cost of inexperience. When the United States entered World War II, its senior commanders faced a harsh reality. Many had never led troops in modern, large-scale combat. Years of peacetime service had produced officers skilled in administration and training, but untested under the pressure of real war. Early campaigns exposed these weaknesses quickly, and the cost of inexperience was paid in lives, lost equipment, and failed operations. One of the clearest examples came in North Africa in 1942 and early 1943. American forces entered the theater confident but unprepared. Command structures were confused, intelligence was often incomplete, and coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was poor. German commanders exploited these flaws with speed and precision. Units were sometimes deployed without proper reconnaissance, leaving them vulnerable to ambush and counterattack. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia became a defining moment. American forces, spread thin and poorly coordinated, were struck by experienced German units using combined arms tactics. Conflicting orders, slow reactions, and weak defensive positioning led to a rapid collapse of American lines. Entire units retreated in disorder. Equipment was abandoned, and morale suffered. For many American commanders, Kasserine was a brutal wake-up call that revealed the gap between theory and battlefield reality. Leadership failures were not limited to tactical decisions. Some commanders struggled to communicate clearly with subordinates, or failed to adapt plans once conditions changed. Rigid adherence to orders proved dangerous when situations evolved rapidly. In several cases, officers were slow to recognize when units needed to withdraw or reposition, resulting in unnecessary losses. The enemy, by contrast, demonstrated flexibility and initiative, reinforcing the importance of experience and decisive leadership. In the Pacific, early command mistakes took different forms. American and Allied forces underestimated Japanese capabilities and resolve. Defensive planning in places like the Philippines failed to account for Japan's speed, coordination, and willingness to accept heavy losses. Commanders faced impossible situations with limited resources, outdated equipment, and inadequate air and naval support. While individual bravery was common, leadership at higher levels often lacked realistic options. The fall of Bataan illustrated the consequences of strategic and logistical failure. American and Filipino forces fought courageously, but were cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Command decisions made before the war left them vulnerable, and once Japanese forces gained the upper hand, collapse became inevitable. The suffering that followed highlighted how leadership decisions made months earlier could determine outcomes long after combat began. Air and naval command also faced early challenges. Coordination between services was inconsistent, and rivalries sometimes interfered with effective planning. Intelligence sharing was imperfect, and command authority was not always clearly defined. These issues complicated operations and delayed responses at critical moments. Despite these failures, the American command system proved capable of self-correction. The U.S. military showed a willingness to identify ineffective leaders and remove them from command. This process was often painful and controversial, but it was essential. Officers who demonstrated adaptability, decisiveness, and an ability to learn replaced those who could not adjust to the demands of modern war. The cost of early command mistakes was high. Lives were lost, opportunities missed, and confidence shaken. Yet these failures forced change. They exposed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored and set the stage for a transformation in how American commanders planned, communicated, and fought. World War II made it clear that leadership could not be improvised. It had to be tested, refined, and held accountable. The lessons learned from early mistakes would shape American command for the remainder of the war, turning hard failure into the foundation for future success. Learning to command. How American leaders adapted under fire. The shock of early failures forced American commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. Victory would not come through confidence or resources alone. It would require rapid adaptation, honest assessment, and a willingness to change how war was led. World War II became a proving ground where leadership was tested relentlessly, and those who could not adapt were replaced. This process of learning under fire transformed American command from inexperience into effectiveness. One of the most important changes was the emphasis on accountability. Unlike some armies that protected senior officers regardless of performance, the U.S. military increasingly evaluated commanders based on results. Officers who failed to coordinate effectively, communicate clearly, or respond decisively were relieved of command. This practice sent a clear message throughout the ranks. Leadership positions were earned through competence, not seniority alone. While controversial, this approach improved overall effectiveness and morale among troops who saw poor leadership corrected. Commanders also learned to decentralize decision-making. Early in the war, rigid control from higher headquarters often delayed responses and prevented initiative. Combat experience revealed that junior officers and non-commissioned officers were frequently best positioned to make immediate decisions. American doctrine evolved to encourage initiative at lower levels, allowing units to exploit opportunities and react quickly to changing conditions. This flexibility became a major advantage over enemies whose command structures were more rigid. Training for commanders changed accordingly. Staff officers studied combat reports, analyzed failures, and revised procedures. War games and exercises became more realistic, incorporating lessons learned from recent operations. Emphasis shifted toward combined arms coordination, logistics planning, and intelligence integration. Commanders were expected to understand not only their own units, but how infantry, armor, artillery, air support, and naval forces work together. In Europe, leaders like Omar Bradley refined methods that emphasized careful planning and coordination. Bradley focused on maintaining unit cohesion, managing logistics, and applying steady pressure rather than seeking dramatic breakthroughs at any cost. His approach reduced unnecessary losses and ensured that advances could be sustained. In contrast, George S. Patton embodied aggressive leadership, prioritizing speed, surprise, and relentless movement. Patton's style exploited enemy weaknesses and disrupted German defenses, particularly during rapid advances across France. Though controversial, his methods demonstrated how bold leadership could achieve decisive results when used appropriately. At the strategic level, Dwight D. Eisenhower's leadership exemplified adaptation in coalition warfare. Eisenhower balanced military objectives with political realities, managing forces from multiple nations with different priorities. His ability to maintain unity among allies was critical. Decisions surrounding the timing of major operations, allocation of resources, and coordination between fronts required constant negotiation and compromise. Eisenhower's success demonstrated that leadership in World War II extended beyond the battlefield. In the Pacific, adaptation took a different form. Commanders such as Chester Nimitz refined naval and air coordination across vast distances, while Douglas MacArthur focused on amphibious and ground operations in the Southwest Pacific. Decisions about which islands to attack and which to bypass required careful judgment. These strategic choices reduced casualties and accelerated progress toward Japan, showing how leadership at the highest levels shaped the course of the war. Learning to command was not about eliminating mistakes, but about responding to them effectively. American leaders developed the ability to absorb setbacks, adjust plans, and continue forward. This resilience became one of the defining characteristics of U.S. command during World War II. By mid-war, the transformation was evident. The American command structure had become more flexible, accountable, and experienced. Leaders at every level understood that war demanded constant learning. The lessons paid for in early defeats were now shaping successful operations. American commanders had learned how to fight, how to lead, and how to adapt in the face of a determined enemy. Commanding massive forces, logistics, planning, and global coordination. As American commanders gained experience, they confronted one of the greatest challenges of World War II, commanding forces on a scale never before attempted. The war demanded not only battlefield leadership, but mastery of logistics, planning, and coordination across continents and oceans. For the United States, success depended on the ability to move, supply, and synchronize millions of troops in multiple theaters simultaneously. Logistics became the foundation of command. American leaders quickly learned that battles were won or lost long before the first shot was fired. Every division required food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, and transportation. In Europe, these supplies had to cross the Atlantic and then move across damaged ports, roads, and railways. In the Pacific, distances were even greater, with supplies traveling thousands of miles to isolated islands. Commanders who failed to plan logistics carefully risked stalling entire offensives. The U.S. Army developed complex supply systems to support advancing forces. Ports were repaired and expanded under fire. Temporary harbors, such as those used after the Normandy landings, allowed massive quantities of equipment to be unloaded directly onto beaches. Engineers built roads, bridges, and pipelines as armies advanced. One of the most ambitious projects was the Red Ball Express, a non-stop trucking operation that kept fuel and supplies flowing to Allied forces racing across France in 1944. These efforts demonstrated that command decisions extended far beyond the front lines. Planning large-scale operations required unprecedented coordination. Amphibious invasions, strategic bombing campaigns, and ground offensives had to be timed precisely. Delays in one area could ripple across entire theaters. Commanders relied on detailed staff work, intelligence analysis, and constant communication. Yet plans had to remain flexible. Weather, enemy actions, and unforeseen obstacles frequently forced adjustments. Effective commanders balanced preparation with adaptability. Global coordination added another layer of complexity. American leaders worked closely with allies whose priorities did not always align. British, Soviet, and later French forces each had strategic goals shaped by geography and politics. Decisions about where to allocate troops, ships, and aircraft required negotiation at the highest levels. Maintaining unity among allies was as critical as defeating the enemy. Commanders like Eisenhower spent as much time managing relationships as directing operations. In the Pacific, coordination between the Navy, Marines, Army, and Air Forces was essential. Naval commanders managed carrier task forces, submarine operations, and amphibious landings. Ground commanders depended on naval gunfire and air support. The sheer scale of operations demanded clear command structures to avoid confusion and rivalry. Over time, joint command arrangements improved, reducing duplication and increasing efficiency. Intelligence played a vital role in planning. Commanders depended on reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and battlefield reports to understand enemy intentions. Code-breaking successes, particularly against German and Japanese communications, provided crucial advantages. However, intelligence was never perfect. Commanders had to make decisions with incomplete information, weighing risks against opportunities. The ability to command massive forces ultimately became one of America's greatest strengths. Industrial production ensured that losses could be replaced. Logistics ensured that advances could continue. Planning ensured that operations supported broader strategic goals. Coordination ensured that different branches and allies worked toward a common objective. World War II transformed the nature of military command. Leadership now required systems thinking, long-term planning, and an understanding of global interdependence. American commanders learned that victory depended not only on courage and tactics, but on the invisible networks of supply, communication, and cooperation that sustained armies in the field. These lessons would shape modern military doctrine long after the war ended. Commanding massive forces in World War II became a blueprint for how the United States would approach global conflict in the future. Command under pressure. Decisions that shaped the outcome of the war. World War II placed American commanders under levels of pressure never before experienced. Decisions were made with incomplete information, under time constraints, and with the knowledge that mistakes could cost tens of thousands of lives. Command was not only about planning operations, but about choosing between imperfect options, each carrying serious consequences. The ability to decide, adapt, and accept responsibility became a defining trait of effective leadership. One of the most difficult aspects of command was timing. Launching an offensive too early risked failure due to inadequate preparation. Waiting too long allowed the enemy to strengthen defenses or regroup. This dilemma was constant. In Europe, debates over when to launch the invasion of France reflected this tension. American commanders had to balance pressure from allies, weather conditions, troop readiness, and logistical capacity. Delays were frustrating, but premature action could have resulted in catastrophe. Commanders also faced hard choices regarding casualties. Aggressive tactics could achieve rapid breakthroughs, but at high human cost. More cautious approaches reduced losses, but risked losing momentum. Leaders such as Bradley and Patton represented different philosophies, yet both were constrained by the realities of war. Every attack required weighing objectives against expected losses. These decisions were often made far from the front, yet their consequences were felt immediately by soldiers in combat. In the Pacific, command pressure took a different form. Vast distances and limited resources forced commanders to choose which objectives to pursue and which to bypass. Capturing every enemy-held island was impossible. Decisions about island hopping shaped the pace and cost of the campaign. Choosing to isolate heavily defended positions, rather than assault them, directly saved lives, but left enemy forces behind Allied lines. Commanders had to accept this risk in exchange for strategic advantage. Weather added another layer of uncertainty. Storms, fog, and rough seas disrupted operations across all theaters. Commanders frequently postponed or altered plans due to weather forecasts that were often unreliable. The risk of delay had to be weighed against the danger of proceeding under poor conditions. These decisions demanded judgment rather than rigid adherence to schedules. Commanders were also responsible for maintaining morale under pressure. Prolonged combat exhausted troops and eroded confidence. Leaders had to recognize when units needed rest and when momentum had to be maintained despite fatigue. Rotating units, replacing commanders, and managing replacements were constant challenges. Poor decisions in this area could lead to collapse at critical moments. Perhaps the greatest pressure came from the scale of responsibility. American commanders directed forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands or even millions. A single decision could affect entire regions. Unlike tactical leaders who saw immediate results, high-level commanders often waited days or weeks to see the consequences of their choices. This delay increased uncertainty and stress. Despite these pressures, American command gradually became more effective. Leaders learned to balance aggression with caution, planning with flexibility. They accepted that no plan would survive contact with the enemy and prepared alternatives accordingly. Experience sharpened judgment and reduced hesitation. Command under pressure defined the American experience in World War II. Victory was not the result of flawless planning, but of leaders willing to decide, adapt, and persist despite uncertainty. These decisions shaped the course of the war and determined how and when it would end. Victory in Europe and the final tests of American command. By late 1944 and early 1945, American commanders in Europe faced their final and most demanding tests. German forces were retreating, but they were far from defeated. The collapse of Nazi Germany would require sustained pressure, careful coordination with allies, and restraint in moments where revenge or haste could undermine long-term goals. Command at this stage of the war was about finishing decisively without losing control. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested American leadership under extreme conditions. The surprise German offensive through the Ardennes caught Allied forces off guard and created a crisis along the Western Front. American commanders had to react quickly, often with limited information and under severe weather that grounded air support. Decisions made in the first days of the offensive determined whether German forces would break through or be contained. The ability to stabilize the front, rush reinforcements, and hold key positions such as Bastogne demonstrated how far American command had evolved since the early failures of the war. As the German offensive collapsed, American leaders shifted focus to crossing the Rhine River. This natural barrier represented the last major defensive line protecting the German heartland. Planning the crossing required coordination of engineers, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power on a massive scale. When American forces unexpectedly captured the bridge at Remagen intact in March 1945, commanders had to act immediately. They committed forces rapidly, accepting risk, in order to exploit the opportunity. This decision accelerated the collapse of German defenses and demonstrated decisive command under pressure. Once across the Rhine, American forces advanced rapidly into Germany. Commanders now faced new responsibilities. Combat operations continued, but occupation planning began even before fighting ended. Leaders had to balance aggressive pursuit of retreating German units with the need to prevent chaos, looting, and civilian suffering. Maintaining discipline became critical. American command emphasized restraint, understanding that how victory was achieved would shape the post-war world. The liberation of concentration camps presented another profound challenge. American units encountering camps such as Dachau and Buchenwald were confronted with evidence of mass murder and unimaginable cruelty. Commanders had to respond immediately, securing the camps, providing medical aid, and documenting what they found. These moments reinforced the moral weight of command decisions made throughout the war and underscored why victory mattered beyond military success. Coordination with Allied forces intensified as the end approached. American commanders worked closely with British and Soviet counterparts to define zones of advance and occupation. Political considerations became inseparable from military ones. Decisions about where to stop advancing, when to link up with Soviet forces, and how to manage surrender were carefully controlled to prevent misunderstandings or conflict among allies. Germany's surrender in May 1945 marked the end of combat in Europe, but not the end of responsibility. American commanders oversaw the transition from war to occupation, ensuring disarmament, maintaining order, and beginning reconstruction. These tasks required patience, administrative skill, and long-term vision rather than battlefield aggression. Victory in Europe was not a single moment, but a process managed through disciplined command. The final phase of the war demonstrated how American leadership had matured. Commanders balanced speed with control, aggression with restraint, and military success with political responsibility. The European War ended as a testament to how far American command had come since 1941. The lessons learned in defeat, adaptation, and coordination had shaped a leadership capable of concluding the conflict decisively. Yet even as victory was secured in Europe, American commanders faced one final challenge: applying those lessons to end the war in the Pacific. The Pacific Endgame, command decisions, and the road to Japan's surrender. While victory in Europe brought relief, American commanders in the Pacific faced the most difficult decisions of the entire war. Unlike Germany, Japan showed no signs of imminent collapse after years of heavy losses. Battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated that Japanese forces would fight to near total destruction, often drawing civilians into the fighting. These realities shaped the final phase of American command in the Pacific, where every option carried enormous consequences. By mid-1945, American naval and air power dominated the Pacific. Japan's fleet had been largely destroyed, its air force depleted, and its shipping strangled by submarine warfare. Strategic bombing campaigns devastated Japanese cities and industry. Yet despite these blows, Japan's leadership remained divided. Some factions favored negotiation, while others insisted on continued resistance, hoping to inflict enough casualties to force better surrender terms. American commanders had to assume that an invasion of Japan would meet fierce resistance. Planning for a potential invasion known as Operation Downfall, revealed the scale of the challenge. The operation was divided into two phases, beginning with landings on southern Japan. American planners estimated casualties could reach hundreds of thousands. These estimates were informed by experience, not speculation. The ferocity of Japanese defense at Okinawa suggested that an invasion of the home islands would be even more costly. Commanders understood that such an operation would likely involve prolonged fighting, civilian casualties, and massive destruction. At the same time, American leaders intensified pressure through bombing and blockade. B-29 bombers struck Japanese cities repeatedly, destroying infrastructure and reducing industrial output. Naval forces tightened control of sea lanes, cutting off supplies of food and fuel. These measures were intended to weaken Japan's ability to continue the war and to demonstrate the futility of further resistance. Yet commanders recognized that pressure alone might not force a timely surrender. The introduction of atomic weapons placed unprecedented responsibility on American command. The decision to use these weapons was made at the highest political level, but military commanders understood their strategic purpose. The goal was to end the war quickly, avoiding a prolonged invasion and further loss of life on both sides. The destructive power of atomic bombs exceeded anything previously seen, and their use would change warfare forever. When atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, combined with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, the strategic situation shifted dramatically. Japanese leadership faced undeniable evidence that continued resistance was impossible. For American commanders, the outcome they had sought, an end to the war, was finally within reach. Japan's decision to surrender brought an abrupt end to years of relentless combat. Yet the relief was mixed with gravity. Commanders knew that the methods used to end the war carried moral and historical weight. The Pacific Endgame was not simply a military conclusion, but a moment that would shape global politics and ethical debate for generations. The final phase of the Pacific War tested American command at every level. It required balancing military necessity with humanitarian consequences, urgency with responsibility. The decisions made in 1945 ended the deadliest conflict in human history, but they also marked the beginning of a new and uncertain era. The legacy of American command in World War II. World War II ended with the United States standing as one of the central powers shaping the post-war world. This outcome was not inevitable. It was the result of a command system that evolved under extreme pressure, learned from failure, and adapted faster than its enemies. The legacy of American command in World War II lies not in flawless execution, but in the ability to improve while fighting the most destructive conflict in history. American commanders entered the war with limited experience in modern global warfare. Early mistakes revealed weaknesses in leadership, coordination, and doctrine. Yet unlike rigid command structures that resisted change, the U.S. military demonstrated a willingness to confront its shortcomings directly. Ineffective leaders were replaced, tactics were revised, and responsibility was pushed downward to those closest to the battlefield. This culture of accountability became one of America's greatest strengths. World War II permanently transformed how command was understood. Leadership was no longer defined solely by rank or tradition, but by judgment, adaptability, and the ability to manage complexity. American commanders learned to direct massive forces across continents, coordinate land, sea, and air operations, and sustain campaigns through logistics as much as combat. War became a system, and command meant understanding how every part of that system interacted. Coalition warfare further shaped American leadership. Commanders had to balance national interests, political realities, and military necessity, while working with allies who held different priorities. Maintaining unity among allied nations required diplomacy, compromise, and restraint. The success of this cooperation demonstrated that modern war could not be won in isolation. Leadership extended beyond armies into alliances. The moral dimension of command also became unavoidable. Decisions made by American leaders affected not only soldiers, but civilians and entire societies. Strategic bombing, occupation policies, and the use of atomic weapons placed command decisions under historical scrutiny. These choices ended the war, but they also raised questions about responsibility, ethics, and the long-term consequences of power. World War II made clear that command carried moral weight alongside military authority. The influence of World War II command did not end in 1945. Lessons learned during the conflict shaped the structure of the modern U.S. military. Joint command systems, professional military education, logistical planning, and global readiness all trace their origins to wartime experience. Future American commanders would be trained in the shadow of World War II, guided by its successes and cautioned by its failures. For the individuals who held command, the war left lasting marks. Many carried the burden of decisions that cost lives. Victory did not erase the memory of loss or responsibility. Their leadership was tested in circumstances few could fully comprehend, and their choices shaped history in irreversible ways. The legacy of American command in World War II is ultimately a story of transformation. It shows how leadership can evolve under pressure, how institutions can learn from failure, and how power must be balanced with responsibility. The United States did not win the war because it was perfect at the start. It won because it learned, adapted, and endured. World War II remains a defining example of what command means in the modern world. It reminds us that leadership in war is not about certainty, but about decision-making amid uncertainty. It is about accountability, cooperation, and the recognition that every order carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. As history moves further away from 1945, the lessons of World War II command remain relevant. They warn against complacency, emphasize preparation, and underscore the cost of failure to adapt. Above all, they remind us that the outcome of history often rests on the ability of leaders to learn faster than the challenges they face. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.